I'm a facilitator, but I want you to think like an astronaut. So we've called this series Think Like an Astronaut. Whoops, we mean Think Like a Facilitator. And the reason I'm running this series is that I've been in business as a facilitator for 20 years. My name is Barbara McKay. I'm with North Star Facilitators. And I read a book by Chris Hadfield, a fellow Canadian, first Canadian man to walk in space. He called it An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth. And as I was reading it, I kept thinking, these are lessons that are great for facilitators as well. So for the first in our video series on this Think Like an Astronaut, oops, we mean Think Like a Facilitator, we'd like you to just think very generally about the facilitation profession. And then we'll go into more specifics of when you're facilitating for an actual event. So we have 3 rules or tips for you today. We're going to turn that over and show you what we're thinking, what we learned from Chris Hadfield's book. So our first rules of the game of thinking like an astronaut is that if you think you're a facilitator, you're not. And I don't mean to be disparaging in any way, but I have learned over 20 years that I'll never ever be fully ready, fully competent as a facilitator. It's always a learning journey. Just when I think I'm learning or I've learned everything I know, I haven't. And so it's like Chris Hadfield said, when he got his call to join the space program, the very first ever space program in Canada, he thought he had arrived at the top of the mountain. In a sense he had. He'd arrived at one of the peaks of the mountain. And that's what you'll find constantly throughout your career as both an internal or external facilitator. Just when you think you've got to the top of the mountain, there's yet another mountain to climb. It's just an engaging process that keeps you learning for life. Everything you learn in this life is applicable to facilitation. Our second tip, what you need to know. You need to be competent, and yet the competencies are vastly different. Sometimes they're incredibly complex, and other times they're so simple. It's like setting up a room is a simple task. Everyone needs to know how to set up a room, and yet, do you know how to do that? Do you know how to listen well to clients? Do you know how to make sure there's enough food? Do you know how to actually time out your agenda? Well, those are some of the simple tasks you need, as well as obviously the more complex one of helping a very large or difficult group arrive at consensus. That's a more complex task, but the simple ones are equally as important, and you need to keep practicing them, because if you don't, things won't go well. Our third tip for this video is everything counts. You want to make sure you're getting ready to play, as Chris Hadfield says, David Bowie's song, The Rocket Man. He was always playing to get to that walk in space. Sometimes an astronaut never gets to walk in space, but everything he did, he was preparing to walk in space, although he may never get there. And that's the same with facilitation. Sometimes we think, oh, I just want this really fantastic job. I want to do something so important and have such a big impact in life. And we may never get asked to do those big jobs. But the small jobs, they're really important too. I remember working for the Manitoba facilitator, the Manitoba midwives, and I just loved that. It was a very small, simple job, but it was very powerful and very meaningful. And that counts just as much as when I got called to facilitate, many, many different tribal groups in the Amazon basin, to protect the Amazon basin. That is maybe the biggest job of my life, but I was always preparing myself, and I still prepare myself for perhaps that one big event, that one big spacewalk in life. We'll see you again for another series of tips of thinking like an astronaut. Thank you again. I'm Barbara McKay of North Star Facilitators.